Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, everyone, welcome back to Nets in the Water. I'm your host, John Barreto, stoking the flame of Catholic education. And today we have, as far as I'm concerned, the president of Catholic education, the president of the National Catholic Education Association, Dr. Steve Cheeseman, on today. Thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Cheeseman. I'm very excited to have you here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into, first off, a little bit about how you even got into Catholic education. I feel like a theme on these podcasts has been there are very interesting routes that people take to Catholic education. It's one of those jobs that you very seldom hear a kid be excited, like, I want to be a Catholic school teacher, but the people who do it love it with their whole heart. And then from there, you've been going on this crazy tour of Catholic schools all over the nation as you've entered into this new role, and then just your perspective on that. But first and foremost, I like to come into these podcasts a little bit blind so I can do this live, but I don't really know that much about you other than your name and your role and just some baseline knowledge. But for everyone watching, what's the 3 to 5 minute pitch of who Dr. Cheeseman is?
So let me start with the fact that I am a husband and a father. So I've been married for 27 years Beautiful. To my wife, Danielle. I have 3 children, Stephen, Chrissy, and Emily. They are 26, 24, and 19. So that's the first and probably most important piece of who I am. Professionally, I started my educational career as a teacher in Catholic school right out of college. I taught at the school I went to. So I was student teaching, and Sister Christy, who was the assistant principal, basically put her arm around me one day and said, "Hey, do you want a job?" And so I said yes and continued teaching there. After that, I taught there for a few years, and then after the birth of my son, I went to public school for a little while. I was a public school teacher and then a middle school assistant principal for a short period of time until the principalship of that same school opened, and I had the opportunity to go back to Catholic education. So I was principal for 9 years of a 7 to 12 school. And then one day I was tapped to become associate superintendent of schools for the Diocese of Rockville Center. And I did that, was in that role for about 6 years, I think. And then I became superintendent of Catholic schools for the Diocese of Bridgeport. And I did that for a little over 8 years. And then now I find myself in this new role as president and CEO of the National Catholic Educational Association.
Wow. Where was your original teaching was based out of the New England area, as we can tell by your accent?
I'm actually from Long Island in New York.
Nice.
I was on the east end of Long Island.
Okay. Wonderful. And then, you transitioned through there. Now, this first time teaching, you touched on this for a second. You just kind of went into this role as an assistant or a student teacher. Why did you even start with that? Why did you do that?
So I loved my experience in Catholic schools. I had, I went to this high school. I was really connected to the high school. I had a strong affinity for the Sisters of Mercy and for the work that they did. I'm not sure I had a super strong affinity when I was there, but I think in retrospect, you learn to appreciate things.
Yeah, you see all the care.
Yeah, and so I decided to do my student teaching there. Even though the college said, you might want to consider a public school so that you can get an in. And I said, no, I really want to be in this school. And there's just something about the Catholic school environment that once you experience it, it never leaves you, and it becomes a part of you. And, it's interesting. When I was the assistant principal in a public middle school, that was during 9/11. So I was an assistant principal of a middle school when 9/11 happened. And as you could imagine, being on Long Island, we had a lot of families impacted by that event. And, I after it happened and you think back about how you dealt with the situation as a school leader, I knew there was something missing in what we did. And I talked to my wife one day and I'm like, we brought in the counselors, we worked with the teachers, we provided support to the families, but really what was missing is we couldn't pray. And, that to me was a real missing piece, that you could not bring faith into a situation that is a time when you need your faith, right? A tragedy, and you want kids to be able to know that they're not alone in this, and that really bothered me. And so when the principalship opened up of the Catholic high school, I really jumped at the chance. I mean, without hesitation, I made the leap back to Catholic schools, and I never regretted the decision once. It was home, and I was happy to be there.
Yeah, it is. It seems to be as a theme of just educators who were in it and then stepped away and then got back in it. There's such a theme of like, you really don't know what you have until you don't have it. Even I'm a product of Catholic education. That's part of my passion and motivation for this podcast is I'm a product of Catholic education. And aside from the biggest factor being my parents who raised me in the faith, I owe a lot of my salvation to my time in Catholic education. And it's very frustrating from my perspective as someone who respects it, but I'm sure also from your perspective, when people say things like Catholic education is dying or like everything is floundering, and I'm sure there's areas to improve upon, and there are challenges Catholic education always faces, but the people who actually experience it and are in it, who see the good in it, are deeply convicted of it, as like you're a witness of, as your passion for Catholic education is, because it's no accident that you went from student teacher to principal to associate super to superintendent to president of NCEA and CEO. That's not the sort of thing that happens from a guy who isn't convicted of the goodness in Catholic education. That also, I would imagine, is supported by your thirst levels, your passion to go visit all these schools that you have. You just read us off at lunch before we hit record, some pretty impressive stats on the travels you've been making in your new role as president and CEO of NCEA.
Yeah, I'm now about 8 months into the job, and when I took the position, I committed myself to traveling around the country, really to get to know the people who were doing the work. And I mean, I knew the people in my little area of the world, but everywhere is different, and Catholic schools are different, communities are different, challenges are different,
sure,
opportunities are different. So I wanted to make sure that before I got into this position where I was, helping to make programs or provide leadership or inspiration or whatever, I wanted to make sure I understood the people that I was working for. And so I started this trip, and I'm grateful that I've had that opportunity. I've spent 6 months on the road. Basically, I kissed my wife goodbye in October, and I'll see her at convention in a few weeks. I'm joking, but sort of. Don't ask her that question. But so over the past 6 months, I've been in 23 dioceses around the country. I've visited about 75 schools during that time. And we calculated the miles. I think I've traveled a total of 72,000 miles in 6 months, which shocked me when I heard it.
It's a crazy number.
Yeah,
how many students does that surround your eyes? People.
Total people. If you were to add all the teachers, staff, and students in those 75 schools, you're looking at about 35,000 people. Now, obviously, I didn't interact with all of them.
Yeah,
but it's I got a taste of that, right?
Sure.
So right now, Catholic schools, so if you look at NCEA and our membership, so our membership of schools and teachers, so we have about almost 6,000 schools in the country. We have about 150, a little more than 150,000 teachers, and 1.6 million students in Catholic schools in this country. And so, it's kind of neat that I got to meet a good subsection of that group.
That is a crazy number when you think about it. I always, when I think about numbers of people, I think about it in context of stadiums. In Tampa, at least the Tampa Bay Rays old stadium was 32,000. So to think of like that stadium is filled with people that you've encountered over the last 6 months.
Yeah, that's kind of cool, actually.
Is-
I didn't think of it that way.
You have
Yeah.
a stadium of people you've gotten to see face to face is like, that's, yes. I mean, to honor you for that, it's such a mark of good leadership and passion for the people that you're serving.
Yeah, it's to be honest, it's been a gift to me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people have been grateful that I've come and visited them. More grateful than I would have expected, to be honest. But it's really been a gift to me to be able to meet so many people, to see all the great things that are happening around this country, and the tremendous hope, the hope that exists for the future of Catholic education. You know, you talked earlier about, you know, the whole Catholic schools are dying kind of thing. And to be fair, if you look at the numbers, there was there's been a sharp decline in Catholic school enrollment.
Yeah.
A lot of that has to do with society and values, what people value. But it also has to do with economics. You know, it's not cheap to send a kid to Catholic school. And how do we, even though almost every school has a generous scholarship program, there's still a tremendous sacrifice that parents have to make to send their kids to Catholic schools. And the one, I think, one positive that came out of the whole pandemic was that because our kids continued in school, even virtually, that most schools did not miss a beat. And they found ways to keep kids engaged in learning, and I think a lot of people gave Catholic schools a second chance. And I think when you couple that with a lot of sort of the angst that's going on in society right now, I think a lot of people are saying, you know what, I think we have to give Catholic schools another chance, and as a result, we're seeing some stability across the country for the first time in a long time. Even in New England, where I'm from, where there's just, between demographic shifts and birth rates and things like that, we still saw in our diocese an increase in enrollment every year post-COVID. Wow. Sometimes they were small, but compare that to, the negatives that were happening. I attribute that to the hard work of the teachers and administrators who really poured their heart into making sure that kids were educated during the pandemic and post-pandemic, and not just educated, but there's more than just learning the academic piece, right?
Totally.
They really found creative ways to make sure that kids were involved in community building and faith building, and that's not easy. And they were very intentional
and
about it.
It takes a real passion for. I feel like another just theme of Catholic educators is this deep care for the students that often I don't think the students can even grasp. I know I didn't. The amount of guilt I almost feel of how often I can think of an educator that was doing something that I didn't like, that I now see was such a gift, and that theme carrying through to nowadays in a culture and a climate that beats down so much genuine care. It's very self-centered it just is. To have a culture of educators who are founded on care, and Lord knows there's no material gain for being a Catholic school teacher versus a public school teacher. It's not a financial incentive.
Right.
That's an incentive of love. It's an incentive of mission. That means when you go to a Catholic school, you have a curated experience for your child.
Yeah, people often ask me what's the difference between public school and Catholic school, and I've been in both, and I was in really good public school districts. There are some really good public schools out there.
Totally, yeah.
And but what's the difference? The difference is that we can own the fact that there's not just an acknowledgement, but an intentional approach to education that says we value the dignity of every child, because they're made in the image and likeness of Christ. And because they're made in the image and likeness of God, there's an inherent value that's such a different perspective than and I'm not saying there aren't public school teachers who might believe that.
Sure, yeah,
but
sure.
you can actually take that and live it. You can actually incorporate that into the work that you do.
Overtly so.
Overtly,
you don't have to hide it. It's just, you can say to a kid, I care about you because you're made in the image of likeness of God.
Right.
That's a gift. That's not something to
Yeah.
be taken for granted.
Yeah, and people say, well, they use the term value-based education, and I would say, well, it's actually virtue-based education.
Yeah.
And there's a slight difference.
Yeah, an important one.
Values are more relative.
Mm-hmm.
Virtues are not. And I think when you can approach education from that perspective, you're really wrapping your arms around the whole child, and you're not leaving a piece out. Not to get too philosophical, but
Please take it there.
right now, you hear a lot of people talk about a lack of identity. Kids don't have identity, and they're looking for their identity, or their identity is this, or their
it's a
identity is
buzzword.
that. Yeah, and the reality is so much of for so often, or recently, right? You hear people beating down the institutions that actually have provided identity to young people. So that, in my opinion, that's why they're having trouble identifying who they are, because society has sort of ripped apart the sociological institutions that for centuries have provided identity. So, for example, family, faith. Much of mainstream society has ripped apart the family, has ripped apart the value of faith. And, just to take those two as examples of institutions that have helped kids find their identity, in the absence of that, it's sort of like, being on Netflix trying to find a movie to watch. That sort of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Infinite. It's sort of like infinite browsing, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, they can't find identity because society has pulled away those institutions.
Yeah, and I think on that, in that same lens, there's an element of identity that necessitates a level of conformity. What I mean by that being that I can't claim an identity with something unless I conform part of who I am to it. I can't claim to be my father's son if I don't, like as a child, live in their house, if I don't eat dinner with them, I can't claim an identity that doesn't have some level of reality to it. In that same way, I can't remind someone of their identity as a beloved son or daughter of God or made in the image and likeness of God if it doesn't come with it. Like, okay, what does that mean? What does this identity mean? If we keep trying to seek identity in a climate that doesn't also it doesn't concern itself with the implications of that identity, then your identity is it's going to be like a block of ice you're just trying to walk on. You're just going to keep slipping through this identity until you grip down and actually look at who you are and put it there. In a similar sense to this, I'd imagine there's a similar thing within Catholic schools of that idea. And maybe you can speak to this. Is there like this idea of, if you're going to be a Catholic school, there needs to be a level of conformity or just concern with the implications of the word Catholic, the identity as Catholic?
Yeah, I think the important piece that you're sort of referring to is our role in accompanying young people in their journey to heaven, right? In their journey
100%.
Towards Christ.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're, in one place on that journey. Sometimes sometimes they're on the path, sometimes they're off the path, sometimes they're straddling the path. Our job as Catholic educators is to go on that path, to find them wherever they are. And just like Jesus on the road to Emmaus walked in the wrong direction sometimes for a little while, like to walk with them and help them find Christ, right? That, and help lead them to that identity that, you mentioned before, a beloved child of Christ, right? That they have dignity and worth for no other reason than the fact that they were created in the image and likeness of God. And once we get them to see that, and that's not something that you just tell someone and they buy, right?
Yeah, then you bounce.
You have to live it. You have to model it. You have to show them what that looks like and what that means. And that takes time, and it takes some patience, and you have to walk with young people, but always leading them and turning them to Christ. And at the end of the day, that's why Catholic schools exist. You can get a good academic education where you will do well in this world from many public schools or many other private schools. our goal is not just to have you do well, but to do good, and to do good in this world, because you recognize not only the image and likeness of God in yourself, but the image and likeness in God of God and everyone else. And in doing that, we start to see that beauty that comes from knowing the truth. So when I think about the purpose of schools, that's really it. Of Catholic schools, I think providing that identity as a child of God and as someone who has inherent worth because of that, that is to me the difference maker.
And take us a couple steps back to go back to all these schools you visited, and now this perspective that you're giving on Catholic schools. I'm curious what some of the themes you've seen across them are. I'm curious on both ends of the spectrum, both positives and areas of improvement. But to start with the positives, we're talking in very heady, immaterial language of just identity and this role. But carnally, physically, what are some of the things you're seeing in these Catholic schools that's really giving you hope?
So there's a couple of things. Well, there's a lot of things, but I'll
Sure.
talk about a couple.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sure.
Yeah, otherwise, we
Too
only
many
have
to
a certain
list.
amount of time, right? I would say the first thing that really gives me some hope is the efforts that schools are going through to support students with disabilities, with special needs. For so long, our schools just have not been equipped to serve a population of students that had learning differences. And schools have been really intentional, recognizing that, well, if they're a child of God, they're a child of God, right?
Yeah, true.
If they're made in the image and likeness
way
of
to cut
God,
it.
they're made in the image and likeness of God. So it's up to us to try to figure out how to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not every school is equipped to do it, but if we have enough schools who are working hard to be equipped to do it, we can really make a difference there. And that gives me great hope that we have a lot of schools who are committed to doing that. And that takes a lot of formation on the part of teachers, a lot of professional development, takes a lot of trust, and some discipline in terms of the organization, how you structure it. But schools are doing it, and so that makes that. I'm very proud of our schools for taking that on, because for years I've heard people say, "Oh, well, Catholic schools only take the best of the best, and that's why their scores are so good. That's why they do so well, and it's only the people who can afford it." And that's all nonsense, because we take kids from all over the spectrum.
Yeah, the demographics are not what they used to be.
Right, and whether they're rich or poor or have special needs, whether they're great at academics or they're great in the arts, whatever it is. What I value about what our schools do is the incredible growth. So no matter where a kid comes in, no matter where a student enters the school, we can actually look at the growth that they made. And it's not just that sort of snapshot in time, right, of how a student is doing at a particular time. It's about the growth. How did they come to us, and how do they leave us? And our schools do that really, really well. And to do that, it doesn't matter where you come from. And again, it's not just we're only taking the top academic kids. That's not the case.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we have great academic kids.
I'm sure.
Obviously,
Yeah.
But it's not like if you're not here, that's it. You can't come.
Now, on this topic of help to students with disabilities, with learning disabilities, I can see why that would be a consoling thing if I was a parent of a student with a learning disability. But to put it bluntly, if you're a parent of a student without a learning disability, how does that impact you? How does that impact the school at large?
So it depends on the structure of the program, because there's all different kinds of programs. There are standalone programs, there are inclusion programs. What's interesting to me is there's a lot of people ask that question, say, well, does that negatively impact the other kids in the school? And I think about the question. I'm like, they're going to meet all kinds of people in this world, and these young people who come in might have a learning difference or some other difference, think of the value that they bring,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not just of the challenge, but they bring tremendous value. And along with these inclusion programs, if we look at that model,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen incredible mentoring programs
Hmm.
where you have, your typical student working with your atypical student.
Mm-hmm.
And just think about doing Christ's work, right? And
Yeah.
the gospel values that are taught in that message. And it's not a one-way street.
Hmm.
It's not just that the typical student who's the peer mentor is giving to the other student. It goes both ways.
Absolutely.
There is tremendous learning that happens by giving of yourself and supporting another student.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the gospel in action when you see that happening.
Totally. Yeah. And I ask that not believing that there isn't a way, but I'm just curious what your perspective was on that. And then similarly with that, makes sense to me how you would apply that practically in terms of like needing different materials, needing learning aids, needing systems in place. But socially, what do you see schools doing to support atypical learners?
I think the key is to provide opportunities for interaction, to provide, and depending on the level of the disability and exactly what it is. So it's not a one size fits all.
Sure.
Right? Which is the first answer to the question, is recognizing that it's not a one size fits all, and that every student, every situation is unique, but really trying to find ways to include them. Right. To make sure that we have welcoming environments, to make sure that there's an understanding of what it means to have a specific disability. And I think the more we make people conscious of that, because I think there's an innate fear of anything that's different, right?
Absolutely.
Or anything
it's
you
very
don't
human.
understand.
If you don't understand it, it's just
Right.
you turn away from it as a person.
But once you experience it, and once you're with that other person, I go into these schools, and the love and care that I see in these schools is just unbelievable. And it really, you walk away saying, God is smiling. God is definitely smiling about what's happening here.
Yeah. Okay, so one thing that you've seen that's given you a lot of consolation is care for students with learning disabilities. What else are you seeing as common threads, common themes?
One of the things that also I think is A, really important, and B, something that I'm seeing a lot more of is people really intentionally and consciously embracing the mission of the church. And I say that meaning that I think there was a period in time when schools struggled to meet enrollment goals, and and some of them, not all, some of them answered that by almost devalue, and that's not the right word, almost focusing on things other than the mission, other than the Catholic identity of the school.
Yeah.
And I think as a result of that, they were trying to become all things to all people, right? And so not that they weren't faith-filled people or they didn't embrace the faith, but that they were trying to be all things to all people. And I think what I see now in schools is I hear a lot of talk about embracing our charism, our founding charism. So there's a lot of talk about going back to, what are the charisms that our schools, come from, that flavor our school, and how do we re-engage that conversation? How do we make sure that everything we do, faith is intertwined and woven in? How do we proudly proclaim who we are as Catholic schools? As my bishop used to say, we're Catholic first, everything else comes second.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of that. And I think that's a reaction to what's going on in society.
Yeah,
right?
necessity.
I think because, we have to remind people that, the reason they are choosing our school must be because of the faith. Now, they may not always realize it. And what I mean by that is, I remember I used to have, when I was superintendent, I would have principals or board members say to me, they're not really choosing our school because we're Catholic. They're choosing it because it's safe. They're choosing it because we have good academics. They're choosing it because, it's a family-centered culture.
Yeah.
And I would say to them, no, you're wrong. The reason you are a family-centered culture, the reason that you're academically excellent, and the reason that this is a safe community is because you're Catholic. It's because your culture, the culture that you've created, and the community that you've created is filled with Catholic identity. And because that's sort of the marinade that's flavoring your school, that's why all these things exist. They just don't realize it.
They don't know the source.
They don't realize that the reason you're all these things is because you're Catholic. So stand up for that and proudly proclaim that we are Catholic, and because we are Catholic, we are A, B, and C.
And that flows from that.
It just changes the conversation a little bit.
I really like that image of it being like the marinade of the school. It reminds me a lot in the midst of this difficulty for Catholic education. I forget what book this was, but it was some writer talking about like how often when people are in dire situations, do they clench down and try and do more of the earthly. This writer used the example of like monasteries close to closing down decide to double down their fundraising efforts and throw a gala, as opposed to increasing prayer and doubling down on vocations. It's similar with Catholic schools. Like our human nature, I believe, this is probably my poor man's history lesson as a 22-year-old, that as Catholic schools have begun to go through difficult times coming into the 2000s and now, they saw the remedy to be, okay, well, these other schools that are kind of eating our lunch, so to speak, are doing these things, so let's do these other things, as opposed to let's double down on what we actually are, which is Catholic. The other side of that coin that I could see a detractor saying, and I'm curious your response to, is, oh, yeah, those Catholic schools are just doubling down on being Catholic because that's all they have now. It used to be that if you wanted a good education, your source for that was a Catholic school. Now that STEM schools exist and magnet schools and charter schools exist, their only trick in the bag is being Catholic. I feel like I can just hear that little guy on my shoulder saying that. What would you say to that?
Actually, I think I would say to them, I don't know what you're talking about. First off, look at the scores of kids and how they're doing on assessments, and how the reading levels and the math levels of public school kids right now. And again, I don't mean to pick on public schools because there are some really good public schools. Sure. But look at the growth and sort of post-pandemic learning loss and all that in non-Catholic schools. And then compare that to Catholic schools, and there goes your argument. Is that even excluding public schools? You would say that, including absolutely,
private charter schools, magnet schools. It's the same thing.
If you look at the data for post-COVID learning gaps, and how students have, the tremendous and unfortunate learning gaps in students. Grade or two behind in many public school areas. And if you look at it for minority groups, the disparity is even greater. That disparity does not exist to that level in Catholic schools.
Wow, really?
Because, again, we see every child, right, as having the same dignity and the same worth. So when you compare public schools, private, non-religious schools, religious non-Catholic schools, and Catholic schools come out on top of just about every academic category when it relates to student growth. And
you touched on this earlier, that would not apply to the other argument I can hear of that's because Catholic schools are getting kids who can afford a Catholic school.
No. In fact, what we're finding is that the number of scholarship programs, particularly because we see what the difference is, and donors see what the difference is when they invest in a Catholic school. You're literally, when you invest in a Catholic school and you're allowing them to bring in students who otherwise cannot afford a Catholic school, especially if they're in an area where there's generational poverty, you are literally changing the trajectory of a student's life. You're not just helping them. You are literally changing the trajectory. You are helping them get out of poverty by giving them an education that statistically, like you can look at the educational and see the difference in growth. And no other system can say that.
Okay.
So, I think there is not, if you were to walk into any diocese, and I just did it, right? So I'm speaking from experience.
Yeah, you have the receipts.
There is, 72,000 miles worth of travel.
Yeah.
When you go into schools, the majority of Catholic schools are not, what you would say are the highest levels of socioeconomic strata. They are not. There is incredible diversity. There is incredible scholarship programs that help bring students from low socioeconomic areas into our schools. And there is, along with that, tremendous growth. Because the other thing, when Catholic schools post-COVID, there was a general, for the most part, an increase in enrollment in many areas. And many of that, almost all of that increase came from students from public schools, many of whom had not been to school in a year, right? So all of a sudden, and this is where growth versus snapshot is important, right? So if you were to look at where those kids came in, let's say they come in fourth grade and they hadn't been with us for, since kindergarten, and they hadn't been to school in a year, right? Their performance is down here. Right, whereas our students were probably here. So if you look at the average, right, that brought the average score down. But if you look at growth, how these school kids who came in and the kids who were there, if you look at growth, you see the incredible difference that Catholic schools make. It's in that growth in students. And that's why just looking at a snapshot sometimes is hard, because the kids come from, you could have a Catholic school where kids come from 20 different towns.
Sure. Yeah, they go
so,
everywhere.
And all different.
But the growth is consistent.
The growth is consistent. Yeah.
Now, having seen all these schools, what would you say are some of the things that you've seen that schools have room to improve on? I mean, I'm sure there's stuff that you can see.
I think there's always things we can improve on, but I think what really concerns me, and so maybe this is something the school systems have to figure out. Yeah. Right.
Catholic school system?
Catholic school system.
Okay, got it.
What really concerns me is the future of small rural Catholic schools and small urban Catholic schools. So two, rural and urban, very different, right? But with the same challenge, and that challenge is money. That challenge is they are small populations, but their population's in need of a Catholic school nonetheless. And my fear is if we don't figure out how to help these schools get stronger, they will not exist in 5 to 10 years. And that is very scary to me. When you think about a city, right, an urban center with high density population, often with great need, if you think of the fact that Catholic schools who have always served, always had a mission, go back to the oldest Catholic schools, there was always a mission to serve the community. If you think about them not being there anymore, and remember I mentioned earlier about changing the trajectory. Yeah, we're changing the trajectory, but it's in the wrong way. Yeah, when we don't have those schools, and the unfortunate reality is it comes down to economics. There's only so much money to go around. There are some very generous people who do a lot, right? Yeah, and that's great. But we need to figure out as a system, and it's something that I hope NCEA can do for schools in the future, is try to figure out how do we leverage sort of a national shared services model maybe to help provide support for some of these schools.
Yeah, because I'm curious what you would say kind of the antidote to that is, but it sounds like it could be
that. Well, I think in one sense, maybe it's shared back office support. Right, so that they, because if you think about it, if you're a school and you have no money, you're not going to have a marketing department, right? Yeah. You're not going to have a development department. Yeah. So it's almost like you're against the 8 ball to begin
It's
with.
kind of a downward spiral.
Exactly. So if we can create something where there is some model of service to provide marketing support, to provide development support on a national level,
That's sick.
that would be, I think, an incredible support to make sure that these schools that are serving, they might be serving a small population, but they're still serving a population and they're still impacting young people's lives. So that's something that, there's things that make me feel really good, and there are things that bother me that, I have to try to find some of the smart people around this country to help me figure out.
I'm sure.
How do we make a difference? How do we do this?
Yeah, because it's certainly not just a layup task. I feel like there's often there can be an outsider's bias of like, oh, if I was in charge, I would do this and this and this, and I would get that right in shape. And it's like when you're in it, it's like, all right, it's actually not that simple. It's not as easy as an inner city school increasing their marketing efforts to get enrollment up. These things are they're complex, and I'm sure you've gotten a much deeper and more firsthand view of that in your national travels. You had a great grasp on New England schools and in the schools in that area, in Bridgeport, shout out. But this national perspective is a much more jarring one, it sounds like. But to touch on a positive note to wrap this up, you talked about these schools that are in poverty or in difficult times. You shared with us a beautiful story of a school in poverty, and that despite the poverty itself, there's beautiful things coming from them.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there is joy in the mission, right? I think it's very fitting that our NCEA Catholic School Convention is the week after Easter, because we are an Easter people, right? We
Amen.
are filled with hope.
Amen.
We are filled with, that commission that Jesus gives us, right? So to me, it's very appropriate because it's a great reminder of sort of what we should be doing. And sometimes you see the light in the darkest corners. And when I say the darkest corners, I mean the poorest corners, or the
most forgotten corners.
The most forgotten corners, yeah. And that's where the light shines so bright. And we were talking about a Native American school, and I could tell the same story of a migrant agricultural school in South Miami. You go into these places where there's such poverty, and you're almost like surprised by the level of joy and the level of hope. And that comes when you introduce kids to Christ. And to me, there was this one girl in this one school. She didn't speak any English, except she knew how to say, "Jesus loves me." And so any question you asked her, she would say, "Jesus loves me." And she was learning. She had only been there for a little while.
Wow.
And
how old is she?
She was probably maybe like 5, 5 or 6. Adorable. So she was little.
Yeah.
And it was just so cute. And I was joking with the brother who was the head teacher at the school, and I said, "Well, I guess she knows the answer to every question, right? Jesus loves me."
100%.
And if we could teach all the kids that,
yeah.
And often. Like when I'm in a school and I talk to kids and I say, there are 1.6 million of you around the country in Catholic schools. Just imagine what this world would be like if all 1.6 million of them left the hallways of their school and carried Christ outside those walls. Could you imagine what our world could look like? And so when someone says to me, "Why are Catholic schools important?" We have this captured audience, so to speak, right? We have these kids who are in our schools, 1.6 million of them today, right? How do we make sure that they are prepared to look at the world through the lens of faith? Because if we can do that, and if we can get them to carry Christ outside of the walls, then I think we've done an amazing service to this world.
Wow. Dr. Cheeseman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This is wonderful.
Has been great. Yeah,
this is great. I love
pleasure talking to you.
Your perspective on all this is just very enlightening. It's very cool. It's also just your leadership is extremely commendable to have gone to that many schools and just put in this much personal sacrifice. And yeah, thank you for going through the personal sacrifice of sitting in this podcast for 45 minutes.
This has been great. You've made it easy. So thank you.
Thank you. So to end out the podcast, we always clap at the same time. So we are out.